Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The last session, you heard the practitioners speak. I think it's time to hear the academicians speak. Uh, the session title being Challenges in the Space Domain, I have selected a topic which I believe is the biggest challenge today as well as in the coming years, that is SSA or Space Situational Awareness. And I'm going to touch upon a short brief on how SSA is being done, how are the organizational systems shaping up, and what needs to be done for India's SSA organization. And SSA, like I said, is one of the biggest emerging challenges, but unfortunately, there is not much being done in international or global forums, be it the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs, and it hasn't received the traction like issues of disarmament are being addressed over there, nor as the importance that is being given to sustainability issues in UN forums. But I believe that all issues related to security, safety in space, or sustainability, to address all these issues, space situational awareness is the biggest enabler, and we need to treat it as such. Now, in recent years, we have seen that there have been a number of events in space, like breakups in space, or collisions, or near misses in space, shadowing operations, re-entries, uncontrolled re-entries, and so on. Many of these have gone unreported. Some of them have been reported. Those which have been reported are many times delayed. And therefore, having an enhanced SSA is a capability that needs to be developed to do something about this. Now, the other question is, even if we come to know that something is happening, what do we do about it? Just to give an example, last year in the month of April, there are two incidents over the Indian subcontinent. There was one rocket body, Chinese rocket body, which did a re-entry, and its remnants fell over. It was somewhere in Maharashtra. Nobody knew about it. There was another Cosmos rocket body which entered, Russian. And though the ISRO was given a message, but obviously they couldn't do much about it. So such incidents will keep happening more and more in future. We have to be prepared with certain mechanisms to deal with it. So what is fueling the requirement for SSA? The major reason that is fueling the requirement for SSA is congestion in space, and to also, to a certain extent, the requirement to have counter space measures and take defense against counter space measures. And for all these, space situational awareness is very important. And the traffic in space is increasing. There will be more and more congestion. Congestion will result in collisions. Collisions will result in more debris. Debris in turn will result in more congestion, and again more collisions. So the cycle is going to go on, and unless we increase our SSA capabilities, we cannot curtail it to any extent. So just to give you an idea of what is the enormity of objects in space, I put some figures on the screen. And if you look at the last one, the debris, 36,500 meters, objects of bigger size which can be detected, more than 10 centimeters, but only about 27,000 of these are being tracked. And I put two figures there because one is the US CSPOC figure, the other is the ESA figure. There's a variance there also. So the number, all the objects that can be tracked are also not being tracked. So we can, there are other objects which are smaller than 10 centimeters which also need to be tracked, and those are in millions. So there's a large quantity of objects which are not being tracked. Look at the number of satellites. Still in orbit, 10,000 plus. Operational, 7,600. And if you look at the graph, the extreme right, it's doing a vertical takeoff. And this vertical graph is because of the mega constellations that are being put up. And SpaceX has started, but there are many more like Starlink, the Amazon Kuiper, 13,000 plus satellites. Chinese constellation, again 13 to 14,000 satellites, all to go up in this decade. And it is said that by the end of 2030, if there is no stringent regulations put in place, we are going to exceed 1 lakh satellites in space. So that is the extent of congestion that is taking place. And of course, it will have some security connotations also. So like I mentioned, if the congestion in space is increasing. We need to enhance our SSA capabilities, but our detection capabilities have not kept pace with this rapid increase in objects. And also the information distribution mechanisms to inform the users of uh, keeping themselves safe are also somewhat archaic. We are still dependent on emails and telephone calls for collision avoidance maneuvers. So what is India doing? For India in 2022, we have had ISRO doing 21 collision avoidance measures, uh, and this is out of 14,000 14,000 proximity alerts that have been received, which are less than 1 kilometer. And many of these proximity alerts are from the Starlink satellites only, and a large number from the space debris. So this is the quantity of proximity alerts that are received. 21 collision avoidance measures have been done because they were almost near collisions. Out of these, 14 in LEO, 7 in GEO, one of course was in the moon orbit. So that is the extent that activity that is happening in space. And mind it, every maneuver in space is going to reduce the life of the satellite. That needs to be kept in mind. So just because we may have some people in the audience who may not be familiar with the subject, I have put the slide so that we are in sync in the further part of the presentation. What is space situational awareness, or called SSA? I won't give an academic definition, but it's basically our ability to have visibility in space, to see where the objects are, to see where debris is, and to identify which are the harmful objects, and to do some analysis and take avoidance measures. That essentially is SSA. And like the chair mentioned, space weather also forms a very important part of SSA, because satellites are damaged because of space weather also. So it's a three-step process. First is to observe, for which we have sensors. Sensors could be radars, they could be telescopes, or they could be space-based sensors with IR and optical payloads. And also lasers can be used for ranging. So these are the sensors which detect and forms the surveillance mechanism. And then when objects are detected, there's a process of tracking these satellites, because when they go around the Earth and come back, you have to recognize them out of those 36,000, 27 to 33,000 objects which are there. So there's a process of tagging them, giving a NORAD ID or a CSPOC ID, and then for sake of posterity and for sake of doing some analysis, you need to catalog these objects. So that itself is another big activity. And once you do all that, you need to analyze. That means there are some softwares which run prediction models for collision analysis. That is another big activity. And the further activity is to inform the users that there is a possible collision going to happen. So this is largely what SSA is all about. So who does this SSA? Now there are multiple organizations which do SSA, and one of the largest network is with the American Space Surveillance Network, which is called CSPOC. Earlier it was the NORAD. Now this responsibility is with the CSPOC, which is the Combined Space Operations Center based at Vandenberg in USA. And they do this collation, maintaining a catalog and sharing it with the users. Now this American Space Surveillance Network has the largest SSA data sharing network, and that's why it's the most widely accepted. There are more than 100 countries which have entered into data sharing agreements with the US for this purpose. But still there are deficiencies. It's not complete. There are many deficiencies in this, which I'll cover later. And then there are other state-sponsored space agencies which have their own surveillance networks. Like Russia does its independent SSA, China does its independent SSA, but most of their sensors are largely the BMD radars also. Then European Space Agency has the second largest network of sensors, largely telescopes and many radars, but ESA has mostly within the European subcontinent, so they're limited in their geographic spread of sensors. So they cater to the requirements of the European nations, but they also plug into the CSPOC. Space Data Association, it's an association of satellite operators who have got together, and they contribute their satellite positions, and the analysis part of us is done by SDA, and it's a profit organization, of course. And there is the ISON, International Space Optical Network. This is sponsored by the Russian Space Academy of Sciences, and they have about 25 telescopes in 18 locations spread across Russia and, in fact, it's the erstwhile USSR countries. So they have this, the largest telescope network is there with the ISON. And then we have this emerging APSCO, which is Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization. It's an organization for cooperation, not just SSA, but it's a general space cooperation amongst the like-minded countries, which includes China and Thailand, Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Iran, Peru, Argentina, Turkey, and so on. So they have formed their own grouping, and China plans to put some radars in these countries. And then we have a large number of commercial SSA providers. And most of these commercial SSA providers are based out of the United States. And I've also put one Indian commercial provider, Digantara. He's still in the nascent stages, but he's the only one as of now from India who started doing the startup for space situational awareness. So commercial SSA providers is the emerging segment now. And because there are advantages in having a commercial setup is that he's more responsive. You can have tailor-made solutions for SSA. For example, if a state-sponsored space agency or SSN says, I will give you a 1 kilometer proximity warning, it may not be suitable to an operator because his reaction time is more. So he would prefer to go a private operator who could give him a 50 kilometer proximity alert. So that's the advantage which private operators have, because you can have tailor-made or customized solutions to your requirements. But there are some disadvantages also, because with large number of commercial operators, collaboration becomes a problem. They will not share data amongst themselves because it's a market competition which is there. And also there will be space operators, especially startups, who can't afford paying for commercial SSA services. So there is a advantage as well as drawback. And so most of these SSA providers' business model is to have subscriptions for providing data services. Some of these also have their own radars, like the Leo Labs, which contributes to the American Space Surveillance Network. So what are I had mentioned there are some drawbacks in the space US surveillance network. So what are the problems in the existing SSA? Talking about the surveillance and tracking first, there are gaps in coverage because, like I mentioned, there are so many agencies, so their sensors are spread across the world but do not cover the entire globe. So what they provide is a part of the entire picture. So unless we put the jigsaw puzzle together, you will not get the complete picture. And because these radars are all with different agencies, there is again a track and revisit approach. So there will be gaps in between the coverage. Largely we see that the southern hemisphere, which is the non-continental area, there is a lower coverage in the space segment, and this gap is somewhat being filled up by the private players. Like Leo Labs has installed radars in New Zealand and Western Australia and Argentina. So this is how the gap will be filled up. Then the object sizes. The present sensor capabilities are restricted to sizes more than 10 centimeter. There are only 2 or 3 radars in the world who can detect object sizes less than 10 centimeters. One is the space fence of the United States, and again of the United States, the haystack radar, and 1 or 2 more, and they claim to detect objects up to 2 to 3 centimeters. But that's far and few, not enough. So if I give you the quantity of debris which is there less than 10 centimeter, it's about 1 million between 1 to 10 centimeter, and more than 130 million objects which are millimeter sizes. All those are going undetected. The next is the microsatellites. Now, since I mentioned this, it's an era of constellations of small satellites, and detecting these small satellites, especially the CubeSat variety, which is less than 1 U. So detecting them is a problem. In 2018, there was a case which Swarm Technologies, a startup company in US, wanted to launch their Space B satellites, which were 1 U CubeSats, and the FCC of US refused permission for them, but they still launched with ISRO. Gap in regulations here, but they eventually went into space, even after the US said that we cannot, these satellites cannot be tracked. So this is the gap here. Now analysis, we have incomplete catalogs. Again, since I said the sensors are distributed amongst various agencies, so the the catalogs will also be incomplete. An object which is there in a particular catalog may not be in the other agency's catalog. And data standards, by data standards, I mean quality of data which is being provided. To have a complete data, it must be accurate, it must be complete, and it must be timely. And meeting all these criteria at the same time rarely happens. And therefore, when an SSA provider gives an object position, it is an opinion and not an exact position. And unless you put all those opinions together, we do not get the exact position of a satellite. And therefore, when we say avoiding collisions, what we get is a probability of collision for which we have to take action, and it is not the exact collision estimation which is given. And then there's the issue of interoperability, because different SSA providers could give the positional data of their satellites in different formats. Like the generally accepted Western format is TLE, but different formats are followed in different parts of the world. Then information sharing, again, I mentioned that there is a large amount of automation which needs to take place, because we are still relying on manual inputs to the satellite operators. So what are the global trends in SSA? The first, there is a realization that SSA is inherently collaborative, because we have to firstly have sensors which are distributed across the world, and then whichever sensors are there with different agencies, all these inputs have to be put together in a single situation picture. Only then will you get a complete SSA, and this realization is slowly coming. But still there are regional alliances which are growing, because there's a growing mistrust with the US CSPOC, because that is largely military in nature, and they do not put all the information for sharing. So that's why regional alliances are growing, and some of the regional alliances I mentioned is the APSCO, the ISON, and the ESA. So these, and China and Russia don't want to join the CSPOC. So perhaps it's time for a UN mandated organization to do this SSA, for which China and Russia may readily collaborate. And it's very important to get them on board, because they have a large number of sensors available across their part of the continental areas. So now looking at the US model, now the CSPOC, before the CSPOC came, since 1961 they had started doing this SSA, and NORAD was the agency which was doing this SSA. And thereafter, when the US STRATCOM took over this, they established the Joint Space Operations Center. Initially it was working along with NORAD, then they established a separate agency. So since 2005, it got transferred to the STRATCOM, then US STRATCOM, then it went to the US SpaceCom, went back to the STRATCOM. JSPOC itself went through a transition from JSPOC is Joint Space Operations Center, because it was a combined effort between NORAD and the STRATCOM. And then it became a JICSPOC, a JIC-SPOC, a Joint Integrated Combined Space Operations Center, because they included the tri-services in it. And later on it became the CSPOC in 2018, after the Space Force was set up, because it became a multinational effort, and all the NATO countries started contributing to this SSA effort. So it became a combined space operations center. And now there's another change which is happening. After the Space Force was formed, during President Donald Trump's regime, he had come out with the Space Policy Directive 3, in which he said that we must gear up with regulations and policies for space traffic management, and therefore a purely military establishment which the CSPOC is today may not suffice, because it's difficult to collaborate with private operators, it's difficult to collaborate with international partners when you have a DoD monitored setup. And therefore this responsibility is slowly being transferred to the Department of Commerce in US, and which will undertake the setting up the architecture for space traffic management. But CSPOC will still remain, because the military part of the SSA has to continue. Now, looking at the Japan model. Now, Japan always relied on the American space surveillance networks. They were more focused on doing space exploration with all their Hayabusa missions and all that. But they realized that their assets in space will also be threatened, and therefore they need to have some military presence in space. And the first thing they did was to establish a space squadron as part of their Air Force setup. in their airbase Fushi. And this first space cordon was the Space Situational Awareness Control Center. So they started, the moment they realized that military needs to be involved in space, the first thing they did was to set up an SSA. And their space surveillance, space situational awareness assets are all with the Department of Defense in Japan. And the operations are looked after by the Air Force, and they are the repository of all the assets. And JAXA, which is the space agency, and all the private operators, they plug into this. And what they're establishing now is something called an open architecture data repository. And through this, any operator, whether it's private or any agency, can straight away feed in information of his orbital positions. And whenever required, they can milk out the orbital positions from the system. So open architecture means it's open for all. And the interoperability part is taken care of here. Sorry, it's not taken care of, that is still an issue. Interoperability is still an issue because you have various formats of orbital positions being contributed to it. Now, the very important question, should the SSA organization be military or defense? And I've been trying to look for an answer for this question, and I have concluded that there are only perceptions based on requirements. And requirements will be will be dictated by a space security strategy. So unless we have that in space, we will not know exactly where to position our SSA organization. So there are advantages and disadvantages in both civil organization or a defense organization. For civil, it will be easier to collaborate with private operators because after all, 70% of satellites in space are civil satellites, and a smaller number are military satellites. But a defense organization will be able to take care of the military assets as well as the civil assets. So there are these two schools of thought, either have a civil setup or a military setup. But there's this third emerging school of thought that we must probably hand over SSA to a civil organization, which will eventually happen when we move to STM regime. So the real question is data secrecy versus transparency, because military obviously cannot make all their information transparent, but to have a complete SSA, transparency is required. So it has to be a right balance between data secrecy and transparency. But to have an answer for that, we must understand that civil SSA is a subset of military SSA and not the other way around. Because space, like you all know, is a strategic domain, and everything beyond designated orbits is a military domain. And we can have analogies with air defense, we can analogies with the Navy doing the IFC and IOR, the IMAC identification of ships. So there are various analogies which can be drawn, but the requirement of military SSA is much larger than the civil SSA. Civil SSA is an object-centric approach, whereas military SSA is a domain-centric approach. So if you look at what all other countries are doing, most of the major space powers have gone for a military setup initially, like US, China, or Russia. India has started off with a civil setup. Japan is still fluctuating, but they're largely a military setup. Now, what are the scenarios in the future? This is a plot from the degree of globalization versus degree of privatization. Now, the United States has moved from the bottom left to the top right. That means they are moving towards a globalized SSA, where the number of international partners has increased, the number of private contributors to SSA has increased, and India is still in the bottom left of this curve. We are very much a government-led thing. It's a national regime. We have still not yet brought the private operators to plug into this kind of system. But as I've seen, most of the SSA organizations have started from the bottom left and moved to the top right. So what would be the desired SSA architecture? And this is only my opinion, and I would invite deliberations on this. Earlier system and even the existing system is SSA by ISRO for ISRO, but that is not the case today because the number of operators are many more. It is not, ISRO is not the only operator. There are many private operators who require SSA, the military requires SSA, and we need to share SSA with our international partners. And therefore, the existing SSA architecture has to change. So all these sensors contribute to a space object information center, And this could be headed by the military establishment, because we also need to plug in our military sensors into this to get a common space situation picture. But if you don't want to keep the military in this, it can be a separate organization, but absolutely in sync with this Space Object Information Center, which filters out the spurious information and gives only the relevant information to the users who require it. And when a space traffic management center evolves, this information also goes to the STM, who does traffic management for all the operators. So to conclude, I'll say the way ahead nationally, within the country, we must increase the number of sensors for SSA. We must have space-based sensors. We must integrate as many sensors as possible into a common space situational picture. This could be a military or civil organization, but it would be favorable to have a military organization so that it's easier to get the military sensors plugged into this. And globally, we need to have more collaborations with countries providing SSA. And since if we develop our own SSA capabilities, it will be easier for us to contribute to any global SSA network that would come up in future. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.